financial returns can only be to serve the prosperity and well-being of people and communities. Once we accept that generating financial returns is not a zero-sum game, it is only natural for financial institutions to want to identify and to optimize the contribution of finance to social objectives. To do so, we must start by clarifying which potential investments can contribute to sustainability, and in this case, to social objectives. Then the discipline and methods of investment and financial decision-making would lead us to develop tools that are robust, granular, comparable, and which can be used repeatedly so that markets can build expertise, build trust, and can grow. Now, under these conditions, it's clear to see that if there were no social taxonomy, markets would create one. And so today, we, the Platform on Sustainable Finance, an innovative and evidence-based part of the European financial system established by the EU under the taxonomy regulation, share our blueprint for a social taxonomy. Now, of course, this session takes place at a time of the invasion of a sovereign country of Ukraine by Russia. Now, while this action in Ukraine is deeply troubling and represents a terrible setback for the world, today's session is not an exploration of the social dimensions of national security, nor is today's session an exploration of the role of any specific industry, be it financial, energy, defense, transport, or other, specifically in the response to the situation in Ukraine. Rather, our purpose here today is to discuss how a social taxonomy can help markets identify and communicate investments that substantially contribute to a range of social objectives, including to protect human rights and to improve the living conditions and prosperity of our communities. First, you will hear from Antje Schneeweiss, the rapporteur of the Social Taxonomy, who has worked so hard these 18 months with her colleagues on the platform, and Antje will explain our approach. We will then have a panel discussion with market practitioners about how they would use a social taxonomy. And finally, I will put your questions to Antje and the panel, including on what should happen next on a social taxonomy. Antje, please take us away. Over to you.
Thanks for your introduction, Nathan, and good morning to all of you. I now present and share slides to explain the first outline of a social taxonomy as we have developed it during the past months. It's very important for me to say that there has been a collaborative effort and work by the whole social taxonomy subgroup of the Platform on Sustainable Finance. So I thank you them all. It wouldn't have been possible to do this work without this help and great effort and engagement from all of them. First of all, I think it's good to recall why we need a social taxonomy, and some of you might have seen this before. We certainly need a social taxonomy because we need social investments for affordable housing, healthcare, but also for human rights, for workers, consumers, and communities. And there is a direct link to the environment. There is a need for socially inclusive measures to accompany the green transition, to have a just transition, which works for all, also for the workers who might lose jobs. There are many investment opportunities, social investment opportunities, and investors are increasingly looking for them. We've seen this during the pandemic, where there was a surge in social bonds, which were highly demanded in the market. And there are also risks. And if social considerations are not considered, investors are actually bearing risks, which has to be identified more clearly. And finally, there's a lack of definitions. So to say what is a social activity, and companies' ESG ratings are actually even debating even more on social issues than on environmental issues. So we certainly need a structure, criteria, and the definitions for what is social. You've seen, or you might have seen this as well. Here you can see that the social taxonomy has a different foundation to an environmental taxonomy. Oh, I'm sorry. Whereas environmental taxonomy is based on science, a social taxonomy is based on international norms, principles, and goals. It's very important for me to say that these are not subjective. These are international norms which have been worked out in a long-standing discussions with the stakeholder groups, meaning governments, civil society, trade unions, and businesses, and these are results of compromises found, and long-standing actually compromises which actually work for years and years, especially when you have a look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we think this is a quite firm basis to build a social taxonomy on. And we actually noticed in our work that we continuously go back to them to see what's in these standards, what's in these documents, and what can we take out of this for our work on the social taxonomy. And of course, this also includes a European pillar of social rights, which is, well, worked out, which is very closely linked to the Declaration of Human Rights and the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So you might remember our first thinking where we actually thought, or where we actually worked out that the social taxonomy is on processes on the one hand, implemented by companies, and on the other hand is about products and services which are social. And this was one aspect which we actually presented in the draft report last July. And then, as you know, we had a public consultation. We had 300 responses in this public consultations, the majority of which came from businesses, nearly 50%. A quarter of the responses came from financial market participants, but there were also many NGOs, academics, public authorities, and trade unions which answered to them. And they mainly told us two things. First of all, they said there are merits for a social taxonomy. 78% actually agreed that there is at least one merit to have a social taxonomy. And they mainly said that it would strengthen definitions and measurements for social investments, because there is a big need for this, as there are so many variants of what can be called social. But they also said that it would support investments in social sustainability, which is badly needed. But there were also concerns, and these concerns were about two things. Mainly, first of all, about increasing the administrative burden for companies with even more reporting on social, and secondly, interference with national legislation. The conclusion we drew from these answers, and also looking at these detailed answers, which a lot of respondents gave, was that we would have to integrate and align the social taxonomy, or align the social taxonomy closer to the structure of the green taxonomy. And that's how we try to do this. As you know, the environmental taxonomy has 6 objectives, and green activity is an activity which contributes, which makes substantial contribution to one of these 6 objectives, while not hurting the other 5. This would be climate mitigation, adaptation, circular economy, pollution prevention, water and marine resources, and biodiversity. So we worked out 3 objectives for a social taxonomy, which would be decent work, adequate living standards and well-being for end users, and inclusive and sustainable communities and societies. As you see, we've worked out these 3 objectives along the 3 stakeholder groups, which would be workers, consumers, and communities. However, we found as the breadth of these, to do justice to the breadth of these objectives, it is important to work out sub-objectives. For decent work, that would be, for example, social dialogue, living wages, health and safety, and lifelong learning. So all the issues which are very closely linked to the work environment. For adequate living standards and well-being for end users, we worked out sub-objectives on healthcare, social housing, long-term care, and education. On inclusive and sustainable communities, we would work out sub-objectives like access to basic economic infrastructure and inclusion of people with disabilities. So how would this work in practice? In the next step, we made even another step towards aligning the structure of a social taxonomy with the environmental taxonomy. You might not be aware of this, but the environmental taxonomy works with two types of substantial contribution. So an activity is environmental if it makes a substantial contribution, and there are these 6 environmental goals, and there are various types, or especially 2 types of substantial contribution, even within the environmental taxonomy. And that is for environment to reduce pressure on the environment and to improve the state of the environment or heal the environment. And we thought this is a very welcome and useful structural element, which we could also use for the social taxonomy, saying that there are 2 types of substantial contribution, which would be avoiding and addressing negative impact. And these would be linked to activities in sectors with high social risks. And the other type of substantial contribution would be enhancing the positive impacts inherent in economic activities. This would be activities which contribute to reducing, for example, the number of people without accessible products and services to meet basic human needs. So how would this work in practice? I give you some examples. For addressing negative impacts, we would actually select high-risk sectors. For example, sectors which are negatively affected by the green transition or by digitalization, with high risk of layoffs and therefore a special need to train and retrain certain groups of employees so that they do not lose jobs. For another high-risk sector or other high-risk sector could be identified as sectors with wages below living wages. This would be sectors with great international competition, sectors exposed to social dumping, and labor-intensive sectors with little added value, like the textile sector and agriculture. Here, with this type of substantial contribution, we would rather focus on the expenditure companies make to alleviate these risks. The other type of substantial contribution would be enhancing positive impacts. Here we would look at situations where goods and services for basic human needs and basic economic infrastructure are not met or are not accessible to certain groups of people, or are in danger of not being met in the future because finance for maintenance, for example, is lacking. For this type of substantial contribution, we would focus on the turnover made by companies to make these products and services available to certain groups of people. 2 more concrete examples would be, for example, housing. The objective would here be the consumers' objectives, which we worked out as adequate living standards and well-being for end users. And more concrete, that would be having less people without adequate housing. We have an ACE code for this. A substantial contribution would be to improve availability and accessibility to flats for cheaper rent. And then we would additionally have do no significant harm criteria for the other 2 objectives. That would be, for example, that they should have an acceptable quality, that labor rights must be respected, and that, for example, the cultural heritage and the environment should be respected. And then I have a second example for training, which would be the other type of substantial contribution of avoiding harm. Here, the objectives would be decent work, and more concrete, preventing layoffs by training workers for a just transition. The NACE codes would be sectors affected by the green transition and digitalization, And a substantial contribution would be avoiding impact by extensive programs for skills and lifelong learning, upskilling, reskilling for workers in situations of vulnerability. Then we would have do no significant harm criteria, for example, on decent work. That would be the ILO core labor norms and national minimum wage. Then we would have criteria on quality. The training must, of course, have a certain quality to produce new skills. And when it comes to society, do no significant harm on the society. It would be very important that there is no discrimination in access to the training. A suggestion we made at this point is that we could have a look at the European social pillar and look at these objectives and goals in the European social pillar where we're working out further criteria would be most desired and appropriate at this stage, and probably would be the first, well, the easiest part actually to develop criteria for and link them very closely to the aims of this European social pillar. And that will be healthcare, inclusion of people with disabilities, long-term care, housing and assistance for the homeless, access to essential services, and lifelong learning. We think that it would be a good idea to make the very first steps to make a social taxonomy more concrete with these 6 topics. And as we have said before, our suggestion is to work out more detailed criteria on the AAAQ framework, meaning availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality, with availability or increasing availability and accessibility as a first substantial contribution for these objectives, which I've just shown to you. So finally, I would like to give you some ideas of what the market could do already and now. And this would be that actually you could establish a list of objectives and sub-objectives to contribute to, borrowing from our framework, and identify economic activities in your company or portfolio which contribute positively to these objectives. You could search for proxy indicators for substantial contribution to these objectives and try to look at expenditures for training to ensure a just transition, healthcare products for underserved communities, and so on, and to start to measure and report voluntarily to customers and stakeholders about these. You could encourage the development of a market-led taxonomy to develop this with market expertise. And once market expertise has been developed, to encourage standardizations through regulatory standards. So these are our suggestions for the first step the market can already do before a full-fledged social taxonomy has been worked out by the expertise of the EU. Thanks a lot. And now I'm very happy to listen to you and to answer your questions.
Antje, thank you very much for that overview. There are a couple of questions from the audience I'd like to quickly direct to you, if I may, before we introduce our panel.
Right.
The first question is, can you comment on why the objectives that we selected were selected? Are there any important ones that have been left out? Just explain a little more to us about this process of choosing the objectives and sub-objectives.
Yeah. First of all, the most important rationale for looking at these objectives selecting these objectives were the 3 stakeholder groups, because most of the social discussions and criteria building is built along these 3 stakeholder groups. Yes, and then, as I said, we had a look back again at issues taken up, for example, by the SDGs. And also by the European social pillar. So these were the resources we looked at when we developed the sub-objectives.
Very good. And you feel it's a comprehensive coverage of the issues that must be included in the social taxonomy?
Well, we keep that still open. I mean, we have not made an exhaustive list yet. Yeah, but we think it's important to always have a look at what is in the documents to limit it to these. to these objectives and topics you find there.
Okay, thank you. And a further question to you, if I may. Will the social taxonomy provide guidance on minimum standards regarding human rights and labour rights? Or should we rely on other regulations for these such standards?
Yeah, minimum standards are very important in the social area. And actually, this is the second task of our work on the platform, which is to define and give advice on the social minimum safeguards in the environmental taxonomy. Here, we have a similar approach that is looking at the documents, which is in Article 18 of the taxonomy regulation, and working out criteria from there on. So this is rather, I mean, the part or the work on social minimum safeguards is done in our work on social minimum safeguards for the taxonomy regulation.
Thank you. And I'm going to keep going because I think these are just fundamental questions about the presentation and the approach taken. So they're best dealt with by you before the panel. Would a social taxonomy follow a similar approach to the environmental taxonomy and be based on nice classifications of activities?
Yeah, certainly it would. And as you've seen, we already started to do this, especially when it comes to the the contribution part, the social products and services part. It's quite easy to find the NAICE codes, but also for the others, we made a great effort to have a look how it will be possible to select sectors, and that implies selecting NAICE codes.
Thank you. Now, a question related to use of a future taxonomy with social objectives and relates to living wages as an example. Many companies do not disclose information on such performance areas at the moment. How would investors assess and use this tool if the disclosures are not there?
Well, I think this is a similar situation as to the environmental taxonomy. We certainly need more information, especially for issues like living wages. However, I see that, especially with the upcoming due diligence legislation, companies are more and more open to actually provide information also on their social performances. And I'm quite optimistic that there are ways around this, or there are initiatives like the Fair Wage Foundation and so on, which is already working very, very diligently on these topics. And we know that the data is there. The issue is to publish it or not, but certainly, especially data on wages and costs are there within companies.
Thank you. And as we keep saying on these taxonomy implementation pathways, we need to provide the criteria and the reporting requirements so that the market knows what to disclose, so that issuers know what to disclose. So over time, the data will become clearer and more accessible, building on what is there already, as Antje said. So maybe one more clarification question, Antje, before we go to our panel. So when we're setting and thinking about social objectives and activity criteria, should they apply to the whole supply chain of economic activities, or are they only the end and last activity that we might classify under NAICE? How does that work?
Well, it depends. It depends very much on the objective. Yeah, of course, supply chain issues will always come in, but to a different degree. I mean, when we talk about living wages, of course, that is mostly a typical supply chain issue. And here we would have a look at what the company is actually paying for a product and whether this payment actually ensures that a living wage can be paid at the end of the value chain or supply chain. When it comes to social products and services, we will certainly have a look at the supply chain when it comes to the do no significant harm criteria, but the product itself would rather be, well, doesn't often have such a great impact on supply chain. I mean, a substantial contribution made by, for example, some healthcare product and service.
All right, very good, thank you. Okay, so Antje, thank you. We've already started you working in this panel, so take a rest for a moment and I'll just update our listeners on a few important points. And I would like to thank the Climate Bonds Initiative for hosting our webinar today. This session is being broadcast live on the Climate Bonds Initiative YouTube channel and will also be available for download on the Climate Bonds channel after the event. And there is a link provided in the chat. In addition, the platform's social taxonomy report has been published. It is on the platform's website hosted by the European Commission. And so you can go to the timeline on the platform's webpage. So you can enter your search engine EU platform on sustainable finance and just scroll down the platform's webpage to the timeline and you'll see the final report. We will also seek to publish the slides later, but I think starting with the report is certainly the best place to go, and you can do that already today. Okay, if I may, then I would like to think about the implementation side of this for a moment and just remind the audience about how this work sits as part of the mandate of the platform working to serve the taxonomy regulation and the European Commission. So the Social Taxonomy report, along with a taxonomy extension report, are being published today. Social taxonomy extension within weeks, and they will form part of a future Commission review about developing the taxonomy framework. Now, the Commission, of course, has not yet conducted that review, and so is not able to specify what the future implementation of a social taxonomy or an environmental taxonomy would be. Nonetheless, this technical work is one input into that review step, which is envisaged under Article 26 of the taxonomy regulation. And so the platform is fulfilling its mandate in providing this preparatory report today. If I might just have one quick advertisement for the platform, we will also be publishing recommendations on additional environmental criteria for the environmental taxonomy within weeks, the so-called Taxo 4 criteria. So you can look out for those additional reports coming soon. So thank you for those advertisements. And now we will go, for listening to those, and now we will go and introduce our panelists. So the first is Victor van Hoorn, who is the Eurosif Executive Director. The second is Marcel Roy, who is the Secretary General of the European Association of Public Banks. Then we have Marco Cilento, who is the Head of Institutional Policy for the European Trade Union Confederation. And finally, we have Jan Notre Dame, who is a Senior Advisor for CSR Europe. All of these panelists have been observing and contributing to this process in some form, and we're delighted to welcome them to our panel today. Victor, I'll start with you, if I may. You work with investors. From what you've heard today, what do you think would be the main benefits for investors in a social taxonomy?
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you to the platform for having me to speak today on this very important event, a very important topic. I think looking really through the lens of investors, the first thing to establish is that the social pillar of the taxonomy is obviously part of this broader instrument covering the environmental goals of the Green Deal, and that ultimately at the end, the taxonomy as a tool is there to provide investors with a bit more certainty about what they're investing in and try and get them to be able to assess their investments versus some commonly agreed performance standards, be on sustainability, environmental issues, or social issues. So that is the first main benefit, I would say. It will allow the markets at large to get some consensus around what we consider as investments, making a positive contribution, or as Antje explained it very interestingly, also where those investments or those activities can mitigate some of the more negative impacts that we're seeing. So I think that's really the very important added value it will bring to investors, because these are complex matters, and as we always say, where you look at the environmental issues or climate change, you've got some scientific data, scientific metrics. They're already hard to assess. But when you come to the realm of social questions, Clearly, the consensus are not as well established. You don't necessarily have that same hard scientific evidence to assess performance of different investments. So it's literally a different environment you're operating in. And I think we could see that also in the initial platform report last year around social question, is that we should be cognizant and honest about the fact that in social matters, sometimes you will have personal biases and colors and in different ways of seeing things depending on which part of the world you're in, or different depending on your social or political lens through which you're looking at things. So I think we have to be clear that it may be harder to find on all these social issues, particularly looking at some of the questions in the chat, some unanimous consensus. So I think in that sense, what Antje presented as well, the idea that we should focus on a number of sectors to start off, where we can reasonably, all agree that there is a consensus that those activities make a positive contribution to the social agenda. I think is a very, it's very welcome development, and I think we fully support that as a good approach. And particularly, to finish off, social issues are, going to be important for investors, both in terms of understanding the impact of the activities that they finance, but as well simply as an investor, and they're looking at your own financial performance, which is still a key driver for investments in general. And you can take on your recent example, particularly in France. I won't name the company, but a company widely involved in providing elderly care, where you've seen that internal governance processes and the approach of the company was not sustainable in the long run from a social perspective, and the rather negative consequences that generated also for investors. I think, this is a very welcome development, and I think it's something we encourage particularly. So I'll stop there, and obviously happy to answer any further questions.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. So despite the challenges, you see the value in starting where we can identify substantial contribution is being made. Is that the key message there?
Absolutely. I think we should start. I think that the steps Antje, as recommendations lay out is something we could fully support as a starting point. And I think it will be really important to also in that space communicate very clearly about what the taxonomy is trying to do.
All right. Thanks, Victor. Very good. Okay, Marcel, if I can come to you, from what you've heard today, from the perspective of public banks, have your expectations been met? Do you see something that's useful here? Is there anything that's missing? If you can give us your reactions, please.
Thank you, Nathan. Well, first of all, maybe just a few words about what our members do and how we are concerned by the social taxonomy. So our members are public banks throughout Europe who are publicly owned and have a public interest objective. That means that they are serving particularly areas which are of interest for our governments and our regional governments. And so our members are therefore particularly important investors in social welfare and services. They are main issuers of social bonds, of green bonds, of social bonds, they're investing in social housing. Also importantly, they have had a particular role in the COVID-19 relief measures. They are acting as counter-cyclical investors and providers of access to finance. This shows that our members have a very keen interest in the area of social investment. We are very pleased to be part of this panel today because we very much support the idea of extending the EU taxonomy to social criteria across the board. And I hope I speak for many and I believe that this report will result in another piece of the puzzle regarding how the financial sector and institutions can communicate on this item. So I would like to congratulate you for this work and this tremendous effort. And we understand It's extremely difficult to square the circle, keeping in mind that the EU environmental taxonomy is mostly based on quantifiable and scientific criteria, while the social taxonomy would not have as much as quantifiable data, which is rather scarce. We do support generally the ideas laid out in the report of applying commonly and readily available social charters, such as European Pillar of Social Rights, EU Charter on Fundamental Rights, OECD guidelines, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and so forth, and particularly, of course, applying the UN Sustainable Development Goals where they are available. So it's already in the presentation by Mr. Schneeweiss has already been clarified the two main concerns that we're looking at. The first one being, of course, that institutions that are already active in the social sector should have ease in applying the new criteria of social taxonomy. So this should not be too stringent or too burdensome to implement. Social services are inherently already social. So the question is to what extent these are defined. If there's improvement criteria, for example. So we think it should be relatively easy and straightforward to be able to identify those activities covered. And the other aspect also already raised by Mrs. Schneeweiss in her background presentation is the question of flexibility. So we have many members who are active at national or regional level in their respective member states. We have a wide range of differences between the member states as what is commonly regarded as social in one member state, and it may not be the common practice in another one. So therefore, we argue that for comprehensive social taxonomy, the social indicators at the member state level should be based on a uniform methodology to allow for these differences. So we find this is reflected in the report. We find this particularly positive. So we have argued from the beginning, in order for this framework to be work for us all, to insist on agreeing on core high-level principles that of what can be regarded as social for the purpose of social housing and social bonds and other, and then to agree to the nitty-gritty, which should then be subject to the respective available member state criteria. So refer to the member state own sets of regulations. So I would stop here. We have some more maybe public.
I'll come back to you. Yeah, I'll come back to you, Marcel. That's very helpful. So, I mean, you're setting out a clear view about the value here, which is excellent. And do the public banks already have a forum or a way of working to start to think about these criteria yourselves, or would you need to participate in a wider process to do that? You're saying there's an appetite, but obviously there's some more work to do to clarify. Have you already thought through what your next steps would be?
Well, we definitely are very keen in participating in the further process. So we're very supportive of the process and of the platform, and we definitely are standing ready to participate in further discussion and also bring in the expertise from our members. As we said, we have different regional, national frameworks, and so we are very much keen to bring in those specific, let's say, perspectives. We're also working within the association. We have a sustainable finance working group, so we do have also a lot of communication between our members and workshops on the topic of taxonomy. So we have our internal work, and we definitely look forward to participating further constructively in this process, because we definitely want this framework to work. And as already Victor has mentioned, I would also highlight our public banks also cooperate with private sector. We crowd in private investors, and therefore this kind of framework is extremely important to have.
Very clear. Thank you, Marcel. That's appreciated. Okay, Marco, if I can come to you, please. why do you think that a social taxonomy would be a useful instrument to promote workers' rights?
Thank you, Nathan. First of all, let me thank Anche and the colleagues in the platform that worked on this report. They have shown to have a tremendous professional capacity. And I also would like to thank the member of the platform for having heard the voice of the trade unions in this regard. You know, when we talk about financial markets, it's not always self-evident that this happens. So thank you very much for that. And your question is exactly what we were trying to do is to say why is important for European workers. Let me first say that for us it's important that we rebuild trust between the financial market and people, and especially workers, because in the last years this trust was completely broken. And for this to happen, we should leave no space for any form of social washing, rainbow washing, or greenwashing. I mean, and all other this way to call activities that are not actually aligned with the sustainability. And in the taxonomy, European level is still a voluntary aspects of the investments. In this regard, I think that's still when financial market players want to be defined sustainable for us is absolutely crucial that accepts to be submitted to some procedural regulatory frameworks, performance requirements. This is crucial. For this, just also answering to some questions that the public is raising, is important to have a specific act on social taxonomy in order to specify what is social in this element, but the social agreement should be strongly integrated. So the fact to have separate act will be what will be the best way to go forward, but it's important that we define exactly what is social, how to pursue it, and first of all, it's important, for instance, that we use these instruments to align public and private investments. In this very specific moment, this is crucial. And for instance, the reference to the European Pillar of Social Rights, the SDGs, is a way to maintain public and private investments pursuing the same objectives. A legal act can actually help this to happen. While we were insisting a lot on the European Pillar of Social Rights and SDGs, because it's important that this, that the social taxonomy can really achieve progress in all aspects of social. And I'll just explain, and in my view, the report covers quite well different dimensions of social, but especially there are two things that I want to stress. In the pillar, you find answers to many of the issues that the people are raising in the question and answer area. For instance, how to address the problem of gender, of LGBTQ in the social investments, or the youth positions. Okay, there you have a framework, you have a structure where these elements are already defined. You can really find point of references, including indicators to show if we are effective or not. That is why the reference of the pillar is absolutely important. On the SDG 8, in my view, should be the driver factor of the sustainability agenda, because there you have sustainable investment, sustainable growth, and you have employment, full employment, and decent work. In my view, these two elements for the future should be considered very seriously. The taxonomy, green and social, will let's say speed up digital transformation, green transformation, etc. So speed up change. So in my view, just transition is crucial in this moment. And many of the aspects that also we have heard until now, especially that also present in the report, many elements that can be part of the concept of just transition. But just to be sure that the financial market players take into consideration this just transition, please look at the existence of collective bargaining. Because if the economic activities that you are financing and the scope of the investments and all the are really focusing on the existence or not of a collective bargaining, it doesn't mean that just transition is placed, but it's quite more likely that this exists. This is a good sign. So please try to be there, verify and check if collective bargaining is there. My last point, why for us is important sustainable finance, and then I will stop, is the sector aspects. For us it's important that no jobs, never jobs can be qualified as unsustainable. What is important in these sectors is engagement and the wish to change things. so that everybody can benefit from investments and engage with change. And in this regard, employee participation, there are a lot of practices where employees in the governance of companies, in the business or in other entities can really produce a change. The stakeholder engagements with investors engagements and dialogue with managers is crucial to implement a social taxonomy. I will stop here and eventually I can go more in details in this kind of things.
Marco, thank you. One of the interesting things you said was about just transition, and there's lots of questions about linkages between green and social taxonomy. And I just wondered if you would give us a broader reflection on how important something like social taxonomy is to make just transition more granular, or more a problem that we can understand in more specific ways. I think that's what you're saying. And do you see that these types of social objectives and social criteria, are they essential to solving environmental problems, or are they separate? And give us a sense of how you see the relationship between those.
Look, Rathan, we have developed a sustainability index, which is built on the goal 8, and we show that actually there are economies where green and social do not increase each other, but there are countries that are reverting this model, their production model, and there are successful stories that we can tell. That is why I was referring a lot to collective bargaining, because for many workers, for the trade union movements, the green sustainability should lead to job creation and to give new opportunities for richer jobs, for better quality jobs. And this is possible because the workers want to preserve their environment and to look at innovation to create better conditions. But still, when there is change, there are people that may suffer from it. That is why I was saying, keep in mind, companies, let's try to talk with us. Let's try to see how we can manage the situation where people are suffering from change. And you will see that there will be a common effort from all the actors within the financial markets, also in dialogue with investors and with asset managers, for instance. This dialogue between unions and asset managers can be crucial to identify what does it mean just transition, and the granularity stays in the sector approach. Every sector has a different problem to solve. A dialogue can identify these priorities.
Okay, thanks, Marco. All right, that's appreciated. Okay, we'll come back to you shortly, but let's now switch to a corporate perspective. John, can I bring you in, please? Companies are in the focus of the taxonomy, both green and prospectively in social, and they're confronted with demands for investors and their regulators. Which opportunities do companies perceive from the development of a social taxonomy, and what do you think are the limits of such a taxonomy? John, we can't hear you at the moment.
Sorry, I was still muted. Sorry. And good morning. Thank you. Thank you very much for the question, which I will address immediately. But before that, I would like to add some of our congratulations to all the people that have been involved in this report. We're looking forward to get and to read the full report, not only the slides. And because there's high expectation out there, at least in the community of enterprises that we are working with across different countries. And maybe to answer your question, I think it's quite well known. Today, there are many enterprises that are at the same time quite proactive, also in contributing to, I would say, this new generation of regulations. Is it the taxonomy, or is it the CSRD? Is it the one, at least the proposal that came out last week on due diligence that came out? Why they do that? Other companies, more the followers, if not to speak about some of the laggards, less proactive, they see this new generation of regulations coming as an avalanche. And the taxonomy is one avalanche in the avalanche. And the social one is the avalanche in the avalanche in the avalanche. So there is today quite a big phantom out there, not knowing what it is about, what the Commission is cooking next. And so there is really time needed to clarify and to bring the right links with all these different initiatives. That is extremely important. So a lot of pedagogy is needed from the Commission, but from all the players that see the value of having a strong social taxonomy being developed at the same time as a climate and environment taxonomy. But what I wanted to share with you is I want to echo what companies and leaders in companies are now up to. Is it within CSR Europe? Is it in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development? Or you might have heard also of the OECD initiative answering a call from the G7, and which ended up to become the Business for Inclusive Growth. So these are all leading companies that want to make equity an equal ambition side by side with climate and nature. Social is the poor child for a long, long time. It seems much more difficult than addressing some of the other issues. Although we all know that climate transformation, green, digital transformation, the rapid demographic change is requiring far more investment. It was said by Antje at the beginning, far more investments in the basics. And that is what this social taxonomy is all about. We also got some evidence for the need of a strong social taxonomy when we looked at the first European Sustainable Industry Barometer, which Moody's and CSR Europe released in October last year, showing that the gap in all sectors between the champions on, is it now the E, the S, or the G, but especially also on the S, we will have a special barometer only on that for next October, the 10th of October, 2022, where you look at the performance of more than 5,000 companies of 40 sectors, the gap between the champions and the laggards is still far too wide. And that is where we make a strong call to industry associations and federations to use and mobilize champions, CEOs, and other managers to bring their peers in the sector closer to the average performance, if not to the higher level of performance. The social taxonomy is a matter of common sense. If you want to unlock private investment for your ESG transformation, you need and on climate, and on environment, and on social. Now, that is why we are going to engage quite strongly in the next years to come, close to the Commission proposal to the Council on fair transition. We are going to deploy a roadmap by companies and for companies first on what does it mean to transform your company into a much more inclusive business model with all the elements that have been developed so far in what was presented by Antje. And we are happy to see that already a number of our questions from a few months ago and some suggestions have been taken on board. So that's why we welcome this. And we would like to see also with you, before the Commission will come, is it in summer, with a more clear view on its proposal, but we would like to see where we can be useful as a full decentralized network of enterprises with large, medium, and small enterprises across Europe and even beyond. See where we can also be helpful, at least first to bring clarification of what are the bits and pieces, the puzzle pieces that are now in the current document that you have been presenting or summarizing. So happy to go deeper about a number of questions, but first, congratulations. And yes, we need a social taxonomy. It's a common sense evolution, and it's coherent with the other instruments, not only belonging to the taxonomy, but also the other ones, like the one on due diligence that was mentioned by some of us.
Thank you, Jan. That's very helpful and very clear. Could I ask, if we were able to make progress on a social taxonomy, how would it help the companies that you work with? What change would it bring? And I'm looking for positive reflection here, because you've already said that the framework, reporting framework is changing so rapidly, and it's an avalanche, several avalanches, and maybe it's just too much to deal with, and yet you say there is still a benefit. So I'm just wondering, are those benefits worth the avalanche, basically? And is there a way that we should work through this to make sure that it's clear and manageable?
I don't know if this was a question to all or to me.
Yeah, I'm thinking of you because we're all mindful of companies.
Okay.
Because companies, ultimately, it hits them. So, yeah.
Okay. So I think the first benefit is the following. We see those companies who have been anticipating since already with the last commission, but also the upcoming of this new commission and this Green Deal agenda, this first holistic integrated sustainability of agenda of Europe. The ones who anticipated have started serious internal change within their companies by making far more departments and functions working together to shape clarity. What is our total impact on society for our people within, in our communities, and further in their value chains? I have never experienced in 25 years such a radical change in the so-called leading companies. And this is there to cascade further down if you inject a lot of time with peer-to-peer exchange and learning on how they do that. And they tell you what are the benefits. They say, if you change internally in a proactive way, well, it really counts, because at the end, one, you can make much better decisions to invest or disinvest. And two, you have more chance to unlock some of the investors' support for your medium and longer term change, which has not been the case for the last decades. And some here speaking, and Marco, you will remember, investors were not there for so many years, except the Boy Scouts, the very early movers, but the mainstream of investors was not out there. So what is happening with the social taxonomy and the overall taxonomy is to bring back the investors at the very heart of the whole debate. They are the ones that really can support companies in their endeavors to bring change, to go about serious structural transformation. So that is what I would answer to your question.
Okay, thank you. So despite the avalanche, because companies are going this way anyway, we need to push through, we need to push on with some of these tools that can help companies tell their story so that investors can respond. So this is interesting. I mean, we need to think carefully about what steps these reforms move in next. But the essential idea that companies are changing and they want investors to recognize that, I think this is a very important, very substantial point. Okay, so I'm going to bring Antje in as well. Antje, we have had some questions coming in the chat around the minimum safeguards idea and how that relates from the minimum safeguards on the environmental taxonomy side and to the social taxonomy, do no significant harm. Can you just give us a couple more minutes to explain these key concepts and how you're thinking about them, please?
Yes, surely. First of all, to explain, as you are probably aware of, for the environmental taxonomy, we have minimum safeguards. That means that the company or the undertaking which is carrying out the environmental activity must not violate certain social standards. That's the idea of minimum safeguards. So the question now is, do we need them for the social side as well? That depends on how we link the social and the taxonomy and the environmental taxonomy. and we certainly need some environmental safeguards for the social side, so that we do not have social activities which are very environmentally harmful. However, we also understand that with certain social topics, and especially with governance topics, we find it hard to work out do no significant harm criteria. I mean, when it comes to taxation or corruption, we understand that it is a whole company which is actually which is responsible for taking care that no corruption and no tax violation occurs. That's why we for certain take the governance part in a minimum safeguards position for the whole taxonomy. That would be true for the environmental and the social part. We also discussed a lot whether there are other social objectives which we see rather in a minimum safeguards part, like, for example, child labor and forced labor, than in do no significant harm or even substantial contribution part. That would be topics where we would say it is the whole company which is responsible for these, and we should certainly assure that the whole company and all the activities of the company should make sure that these basic violations should not occur within the company. This is our thinking so far, yeah, on minimum safeguards and the social taxonomy.
Okay, thank you. And Jan was emphasizing this issue about the overall framework of change, so many changes, the avalanches within avalanches. Can you describe some of the linkages that you see from the taxonomy, say, to the recent due diligence announcement by the Commission, and maybe even to the SFDR or to the CSRD? Just describe some of the linkages and some of the discussions we're having about these linkages.
Yeah, I think it is very important to consider these linkages. I see it, first of all, for the social taxonomy, I see it, first of all, with the CSRD. So we need reporting through the CSRD, which is valuable or which actually flows into the social taxonomy and the disclosure we need for a social taxonomy. This is really, really important. But we also, what we know about the Africa Task Force and their cluster, the social clusters, they are thinking very much in the same direction. We still have to see, we don't know the indicators yet, but what we hear from the people involved in these processes, they also have the aim that there will not be two separate frameworks, which, I mean, it's just a thing which should not happen, yeah. And we see that their thinking is alike, and that's actually a reason, one of the, maybe even the most important reason why we actually concentrate on these three objectives linked to the three stakeholder groups, was because that's the way the CSRD is doing it and is structuring the work and the reporting, yeah. Especially when it comes to products and services, of course, that is a part which might not yet be covered in the first start of the CSRD, but that's probably not the most difficult part. So yeah, we're thinking about it. When it comes to the due diligence laws, we had a close look when we were working on we are working on the minimum safeguards. And here we even more think that there should be a strong alignment between existing and upcoming disclosure requirements and as well regulatory requirements, and we are having a very close look at this proposal. Now, on top of this, I think this due diligence legislation actually will initiate a situation and a development where we see that human rights actually play a similar role as climate change for the green taxonomy, or green sustainable investment, because one of the issues which very much pushed especially climate investments is that companies and investors, especially investors, saw that this is now becoming material. Yeah, that there are regulations coming up, that it will be expensive, and that companies which actually are considering climate change and change their structures will have a huge benefit in the end. And this is a bit like, I mean, with the due diligence legislation, because now we will have fines and companies will be excluded if they violate these laws. Yeah, so there is now a material interest for companies and for investors to follow these new rules, because it might, well, materially hurt them if they don't. Yeah, and I think this is a step, a huge and a very new step for the social issues, which will be considered by the market in the future.
Thanks, Chair. And presumably that means there's a little less pressure on the taxonomy to solve every social problem as well, or every social objective, which is, I know, we appreciate working on the taxonomy because that wasn't the intention. Maybe we can bring Victor in on this point as well. Victor, how do you see this relationship between, say, due diligence laws and taxonomy? Do you have your own view on how they play a different role and how investors will use them?
I think that's this question and this thematic of interlinkage between different measures is a critical one, which was raised by Jan already. I think, you know, the lesson we see and the opportunity we see now is that actually in terms of the sequencing, we're going to now have the opportunity to develop a social taxonomy simultaneously while we're developing the corporate reporting rules, so that we then get the right corporate reporting with the right data. We know with the environmental taxonomy, you know, complaint number one of investors has been, you know, you ask us to apply a framework, but we're missing often the relevant information to apply it in a smart way. And we need that's something where, you know, we know EFRAG and the CSRD process is actively working on, and we're finding solutions around that. But this is an opportunity which is, I think good that we have that kind of collaboration. I think obviously, from my perspective, the due diligence laws, it's a question of, you know, how do companies then, when they report, potentially also start spotting things they might have not spotted in their own organizations or supply chains and start addressing that. So I think it also draws some benefits for companies, similarly for investors. And I think that's for me the interesting dimension of a social taxonomy, but of any taxonomy. It's often seen as this framework where you apply filters and you come up with a number, and then you can tell as an investor your fund is X% aligned. Actually, for me, it's a slightly reductive view of the taxonomy. I think for potentially where I see great potential for the taxonomy is when investors engage with companies. When they start asking the companies a very simple question, which is, you know, we've agreed that this performance level is where we want to go. This is an objective we'd like to achieve. So as an investor, you're going to ask the management of the company, oh, explain to me your plan for getting there. I'm not expecting you to be ready now. I know it takes time, but explain to me how in control of the agenda, what your plan is from getting from here to the objective we have. And I think that's something we have to recognize as well, that gradually the hope is with the environmental taxonomy, but also with the social taxonomy, that investors will use that as a kind of, you know, targets-based engagement tool with the companies they invest in.
Thanks, Victor. It's actually a very important point, especially in this period before there's a regulation, which may take some time on social taxonomy. So we just need to compare this process and where we're up to now on social to where we were on the environmental side, remembering it took 3 or 4 years at least of preparatory work on the regulatory side for a green taxonomy. And that was 10 years after we had functioning green taxonomies in the market. And so I'm very interested in this angle on what you're saying about companies engaging with it, investors engaging with companies today. And so based on the framework that's been presented, where there are objectives and a clear hierarchy and the sub-objectives, do you think that's enough to start the conversation between investors and companies today? Can they take the objectives away and say, so company A, tell us what your framework for contributing to social objectives are? Or is there some key piece that we must provide immediately to help that happen?
No, I think, you know, investors are doing that already. They're developing their own frameworks and they're thinking about these issues. The thinking can be more or less sophisticated depending on which firm you're talking about. So I think that's something we have to acknowledge. However, I think one of the key use cases of taxonomies was to, at some point, try and bring some consistency in the market where everyone's using their own approach. And I think that's probably, for me at least, is where we're probably in the social part, in this iterative phase where everyone's developing and refining their thinking and appreciating much more the interlinkages that might exist and the impacts that might exist. But at some point, we'll get to the phase where it won't be enough to have everyone doing their own approach, and where probably at some point, Jan's members will be going like, we're getting crazy because we're getting slightly different questions from everyone else. Can we get some consensus? And then at that point, we'll naturally move into the space where some standard or regulation will be necessary.
Yeah, very good, very clear. Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to ask two more questions of our panelists before we go further into the audience questions. So Marcel, I'll start with you. So banks have not been the primary target of some of the regulatory disclosure obligations, and yet you made a very strong message about how important these classification tools are. So can you tell us how much the banking sector can do next? What would there be steps that you would implement? What changes do you see that you can carry forward based on the green taxonomy and on the framework presented today?
Okay, thank you, Nathan, for this question. So first of all, I can agree with the participants and what has been said about the interlinkages early on in the discussion. So obviously, the social taxonomy, just as general taxonomy, will have interlinkages with reporting requirements for public banks. So the integration of ESG factors is already on the way. EBA has a 5-year work action plan on this, and we were also very actively involved in that as well. So this goes back to the need to have a not too burdensome set of criteria, information that can easily be produced, and therefore be used for supervisory purposes as well. As I mentioned early on, our members are strongly invested in the issuance of sustainable funds. We have social bonds represent about 5 billion for 2020 and roughly the same for 2021. All in all, sustainable funds are over 21 billion euros in total. So for us, it is important to have a criteria which allow to classify social activities as much as possible. The criteria, the taxonomy should reflect what is social at the member state level in order to be able to conduct public policy, support green and social investments in the future, and crowd in private sector investors. So our key concern will be that the criteria that will be chosen will reflect as much as possible flexibly the reality of what is social and what social sector is covering in the different member states. So this goes back to the AAAQ, the acceptable aspect of the criteria. So here we definitely would like to have as flexible interpretation as possible, ideally, which would automatically recognize the definitions, for example, the social housing sector that we have at the member state level. So this, in our view, would contribute to giving a clear, a reliable basis of information for both investors, the market, but also for public policy. And this is what we're working on among our member bases. This is the spirit in which we also want to continue to contribute to this dialogue.
Yeah, thanks, Marcel. They're excellent practical steps for the sector that you've outlined. Thank you. All right, so let's go on to another theme that came up through the discussion, and that is about the investor response to what companies are doing, the good things that companies are doing. And the other end of that value chain, of course, is the citizen savers and the workers whose pensions and insurance products are being managed. And Marco, if I can bring you back in, what do you think is the role of social taxonomy to help make those linkages between workers' pensions and their savings and in fact, their conditions as employees? So closing that loop. What do you think is the purpose of the role of social taxonomy in that endeavor?
I think that these aspects until now has been underexplored in general in the functioning of the financial market, the workers' money. It's not only pensions, because in many countries there is a huge experiences of worker saving plans, company-based, sector-based. You have employee share ownerships schemes, and that with several practices where the workers' money can really be a voice on the investor side that binds the economic activities to sustainable patterns. It comes from the past where sustainability was not a value as it is today. So probably this practice can be read with the new lens of sustainability. And here we can find the space for enlarging the quantity of resources that can be labeled as social. Of course, there is one thing, when we talk about pensions, for instance, here the balance must be found in a very delicate way. And once again, I say dialogue is crucial because, in the very end, the pension savings is done to ensure adequate pensions to workers. And this is important. This is the very first element. But it doesn't mean that the pension funds, especially when they have social partners in the governance of these pension funds, can orientate their portfolios this way in a way that contributes to the achievement of certain objectives, green, but also social, or a mix of the two, or the just transition. But this is, in my view, must be built on the basis of dialogue once again, because in the very end, we should never intend the sustainability things as a way to catch or to capture the savings, the pension savings, because in the very end, this is for workers. On the other side, dialogue can help this huge quantity of money to serve objectives that are compatible with the very final aim of these savings.
Okay, thank you, Marco. That's fantastic. All right, so I'll bring in a couple of related questions. So, Antio, I think this one will be for you. You've covered or mentioned sectors with high social risks as part of the way for prioritizing where criteria could be developed. But how will you deal with this prioritization approach when issues such as human rights and labor rights in supply chains is more of a universal issue? How do you reconcile this?
Yes, this is really a very important but also very difficult question to answer. As I said, we puzzled and it worked very on this during last summer, and with a question actually. With an open question, we said, is this possible? Well, can we change the structure in the way we intend to? In the end, we found out that, yes, it will be. Yeah, because there are differences between sectors and different risks in their supply chain. And I think the definition we have actually, which comes from Marco, who helped us a lot with this, is quite clear. You can see that in certain sectors, because of international competition or because of a very low value added, there is a particular risk, for example, on wages, and you can identify these sectors, these activities, and say that companies improve in these sectors, that will be a substantial contribution. I personally, for example, had discussions or could compare the situation between jewelry and textiles, and producing jewelry, which is also done in developing countries, has a lower risks of very low and non-living wages because there is more added value in them than with textiles and the very high competition and low added value you have there. So it's possible, it's difficult, it's possible, and we think we found a way to identify sectors correctly.
Okay, thank you. And then related to, I think, the minimum safeguards question, people are trying to distinguish do no significant harm from minimum safeguards. And so would you envisage that you can in fact have clear do no significant harm criteria for these areas of social contribution? Have you started to think that through how that part will work?
Yes, we started to do so, and I mean, the advantage of do no significant harm criteria is that they are more detailed. You can explain in much more detail and much more actually focused and linked to the actual activity what you don't want this activity to be. Yeah, so whenever it's possible, we would advise to work out do no significant harm criteria and not the more universal minimum safeguards idea. Especially now having the due diligence law, having a clear canon of workers' rights from the ILO, we think it is possible. But we also think, as I've indicated, that for some topics, minimum safeguards will be needed.
Okay, very good. Thank you. That's helpful. So, Marco, I'm going to come back to you. The just transition point has exercised the audience, I think. And there is a request for some specific examples which would illustrate how social taxonomy could help on just transition. Are you able to share your thoughts on that? You might be on mute. No, we still can't hear you, sadly. That's okay. Coming in a minute. I'll ask Antje if you like. If you consider that.
As I've tried to illustrate here, we see the substantial contribution mainly with training for workers. Yes, and we've already, or I've already talked, especially to automotive companies which are actually following this path. Yeah, they see there will be changes for our staff. When we produce more and more electric vehicles, and we have to think about our workers and how we train them for this transition for these structural changes we have in our company. So this is actually the way we were thinking of. And there is another topic for just transition, and that is more the topic of land rights. Yeah, in developing countries, you have a problem. Sometimes in some countries, definitely not all countries, you have a problem when wind parks are built or hydropower stations are built, that land rights of people are not considered. And that would also be part of the just transition, that companies have to take care of not violating the rights of people living in these situations.
Okay, thank you. I hope that's helpful. Marco, are you there? Do you want to add anything?
Sorry, I had the collapse of my audio system in computer. Sorry for this. No, on the just transition. No, I mean, I think Antje made some references that are quite useful. I just want to say that it's important that companies that engage, that the integration between socially green are always in the hands not only of the financial market players but also of the regulators, because it's really the point. But if you win the consensus of people in general, because this taxonomy look at this proposal of the platform look not only at workers but also at the stakeholders. If we win the consensus of people, you can really save the green agenda, because the green agenda today is at risk also because of geopolitical factors, etc. You must have a strong connection with people and gain their support, and the just transition measure are main. Yeah, I think have in mind the traditional one: training, education, skilling, reskilling, active labor market policies, but also work-life balance procedures, wages. There are many things depending on the sectors that we can activate, but it's crucial to win the consensus of people and keep the entire sustainable agenda high in the political agenda in general and in the financial markets.
Thank you, Marco. Okay, so I'm going to come to our panelists in a moment in turn for a final comment on what we should be doing next as a community working. on the social taxonomy. I'll come to you just in a moment. Antje, to give everyone a second to prepare their answer, there was a useful question here on revenue, alignment, CapEx and OpEx reporting under the green taxonomy. Would it be the same approach under a social taxonomy?
Yes, I've tried to explain, we have been thinking about it, and we think that when it comes to companies investing in certain processes to improve social situations like living wages, training, and so on, we would rather think that here CapEx or OpEx should be counted. So investments made into payment of living wages, investment made for trainings for a just transition. Whereas when we talk about social products and services, we were thinking of counting the turnover companies make with these products and services. That's how far we came on this. This seemed logical to us to think it like that.
Very good. Okay, thank you to everyone who's posted questions. We have, I think, almost 190. We've tried to do justice to as many as possible, but we'll take them away to see the issues that you're interested in for future presentations. Also, just to restate, this session will be available as a download on the Climate Bonds Initiative YouTube channel, and that the report link is posted in the chat and is also available on the Platform on Sustainable Finance webpage. So just for a final comment, Marcel, what should we be doing next to advance this effort?
We're looking forward to the Commission's proposals forthcoming. In the meantime, our members are continuing their exchange on taxonomy in general, implementation of taxonomy, and also on the question of the social taxonomy. So here we're going to look to a certain number of members interested in voluntary reporting. There are some questions open with regard to not reinventing the wheel using the SDGs and possibly also, for example, definitions provided by existing frameworks such as InvestEU that provides a definition for social housing. So again, here going for ease of already existing frameworks. We have also had some feedback about the do no significant harm criteria here. I must say, from what we see from different member states, is that definitions and what constitutes significant harm criteria or not is very scattered. They have a very different perception of what that should be. So that basically is the nitty-gritty work that we're looking at as an association level. But definitely looking forward to continuing our cooperation with you and the Commission for further work on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel, for joining us today. Victor, a final quick comment.
Thank you. No, I think, and to echo some of Marcel's points that are very recognizable, and one that is the DNSH and the quality of data that needs to be overall improved. And I think, as I said, we need to continue as an industry our work, our intellectual work, to refine the understanding of the social issues and how that impacts investments. So I think you're very much looking forward to continue the collaboration. And I think, having followed the debates very closely since their inception on the environmental taxonomy, let's learn from the pitfalls we face there to avoid those pitfalls emerging in this file as well. There's a potential for that, but the social taxonomy is not this Frankenstein monster that many people might think it is, sometimes in some courts. So let's dispel those myths and keep it facts-based.
Thank you, Victor. That's a very good sentiment. Marco, please.
We should continue dialogue between the stakeholders in order to achieve a very good proposal in future that could become to increase the legislative package around this. In my view, I would explore the possibility to enlarge the scope of the sustainable investments, also looking at the entity purposes, working on KPIs. I think this is a way that we can explore and to see in order to give more chances to investors to behave responsibly.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. I agree. This step on KPIs now is very important. I think we are approaching that stage. Very good. And Jan, from the company's perspective, tell us where we should be doing, what we should be doing next.
Yes, well, what we are planning is first take time now in March and April to digest the report, seek for some clarification of what will be the next steps. But we are conveying our corporate members, but also our national partner organizations. There are 40 networks on corporate sustainability and responsibility. This will be on the 5th of May. And this is for having a more solid reflection from CISA Europe to continue to nurture, I would say, the agenda on the social taxonomy, which we will also nurture through, I mentioned it, the European Sustainability Industry Barometer that will measure the social performance of 5,000 companies in 40 sectors that will come also out there in October. And so with the reflection and this barometer and some other work we do in a new CSR Europe Leaders Hub for an inclusive Green Deal, we are going to use that to nurture the CEOs that we work with, but also the ones that are working in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and this new business commission tackling inequalities, and the CEOs that are engaged in the business for inclusive growth led by the OECD. And last but not least, there is also an agenda that we are discussing as from this week to see where is it that at COP27, business leaders, public leaders, civil society leaders, and investors can take some of the agenda and the declaration that was out there in COP26. And you might have heard about the Glasgow Alliance for Net Zero. This is a huge network of financial players. And I must say, we were extremely astonished, also some of the banks working with us, to see that the social dimension was very, very much absent from their approach so far. So there is more work to be done. And I think the social taxonomy is a huge argument to push, to accelerate this.
Thank you, Jan. Yes, excellent comments from all of you. Thank you all for participating today. I think if there's one theme here, it is that action is underway in the markets. It's already underway. The companies are working, the investors are trying to find the right investments. These are questions now of adding clarity and standardization, and we must work to continue to provide that so that capital and savings and debt can find the places in our economy that makes a social contribution. Arntu, if I may, thank you again. Thank you to the platform member colleagues who have worked so hard. You've done an excellent job today. Thank you for the applause. You can find this session downloadable on the Climate Bonds Initiative website, and please look out for our future announcements on the work of the platform. That's the end of our session today. Best wishes to all.
Thank you to all of you for your participation.
Thank you.